Welcome to the bee class. Thanks for turning up to the honey company's annual bee pickup. So we haven't sold packaged bees for a few years. Because 2019 we had such a great year, we were just selling nukes of our own bees. 2019 was just a phenomenal year. We took one good strong colony that came back from California, 2 boxes of bees, right? About 20 frames in there covered with bees, and we started making nukes, and I got an average of 6 nukes. That's 5 frames of bees, and then as soon as they rebuild again, we take another 5 frame of bees out, 6 nukes out of each colony in 2019. Plus we got a honey crop. So then 2020 started out okay, and about middle of summer it dropped, it dried out, and the bees just started dropping out, and we had 300 colonies of bees last fall, and we've got about 35 now. So we lost, I have 35 now. So we lost 80-something%, almost 90% of our bees this last year. So you look at that and you think, well, how do you stay in business doing that? So we stay in business because we have agriculture in our blood. We got dirt under our fingernails. We've got risk taking and family and heritage and legacy in our souls, I guess. That's what you have to have if you're going to be in agriculture, right? So the question we're getting right now is that, well, my bees keep dying. Why should I try again? So they actually did a study on new beekeepers. If they fail 4 years in a row, they usually don't try that 4th year. They give up. So let me ask you a few questions. So how many of you lost bees this year? How many of you are new to beekeeping this year, first time? Okay, all right, so we got a lot of first. Okay, so I just discouraged all of our new beekeepers. All you newbies, don't drop out yet. So, right, so some people don't have the luxury, I guess, of quitting in the ag business. Let me say it this way. If agriculture isn't your livelihood, keep trying to keep bees. So I'm not saying that so we can sell you more bees every year. We do a better business if your bees stay alive than they do if they die. If you have a good experience with bees, then you're going to want more. So you start out with 1 or 2 colonies, right? And they produce a lot of honey and a lot of fun. And so you're going to want 3 or 4 next year. That means you want more equipment. So our business does better. The whole industry in general does better business if your bees stay alive. So we're doing everything we can to make that possible for everybody, including ourselves. So lately, the bee losses in the last 25, 30 years have been blamed mostly on this varroa mite. Have you heard about the varroa mite? Yeah. So it is the destructor, as they've called it. It's a little vampire mite that gets in there and sucks the hemolymph out of the bees and transmits viruses and things when it does that. And so it's causing the industry billions of dollars worth of damage. But we managed to recover from it. But it's not just the varroa mite that's causing problems. And for evidence of that, we can look back, clear back to this country's beekeeping great-great-grandfathers, clear back to the 1860s, 70s, 80s, when commercial beekeeping started to be a thing, right? So with Langstroth, Reverend Langstroth invented the movable frame hive, which is this dimensions right here. It hasn't changed since he invented it in 1851. It's still the most popular type of size and dimensions of hives worldwide still today. But when he invented that movable frame hive, then there was an explosion of different kinds of beehives. The patent office, U.S. Patent Office, is just full of different kinds of hives that are fun to look at if you're interested in all the different kinds of hives. Many people are building their own hives just for a fun woodworking project. Since that time, though, we've seen the commercial beekeeping explode. And since that happened, there's been ups and downs, and we've had big losses some years, and then you slowly build back up during those average years, and you'll have a really good bumper crop one year, and then the bee population gets wiped out again the next year. And so it's not just varroa mites, and it's not just trachea mites, and it's not just foul brood. or any of the other bee elements there are out there. That's just agriculture in general. So if you can write out the trends, right? Don't give up on your hobby or your livelihood. Keep going if you can. If you didn't have the choice to keep bees or not, or to garden or not, or to keep chickens or not, you had to do it because you wanted to eat, and you gotta eat to live. Then you don't have the choice to quit. So anyway, that's my pitch for the industry right now. Don't get discouraged. We're all losing bees. If it makes you feel any better, everybody's losing their bees too. So we keep trying. Someday maybe we'll look back on the Varroa mite period in beekeeping and think, wow, we made it through. we stuck with it back then, and we helped the industry survive. So anyway, we're also going to have hands-on too here after we have just a little discussion here. We'll go out and look in some beehives. We're going to show those who are new to beekeeping. The most common question we get right now is, okay, now I got my package of bees. How do I put them in my hive? What do I do now? So we're going to show you how to install a package of bees, and how to gently handle the queen, get her in there, make sure she's getting off to a good start. I started to ask how many, where everybody's from. Who's come from the furthest away today? Yeah. Anybody out of state? Where'd you come from?
We're here from Ely, Nevada.
Oh, Ely. Okay. All right. I got it. Okay. You win the prize, I guess, this year for coming the furthest distance. We're glad to have you. We've sold some bees to people in Nevada before, and Colorado and Idaho, and so Montana. Anyway, just curious to see where everybody's coming from. I wanted to just familiarize you with what we're doing here right away. So today you're picking up package bees, right? So they come with a little queen. If you're installing package bees for the first time, they've got a tiny little cage in there. They call it a California mini cage, and the queen's in there by herself. Got a little cork in one end, and she's got all the cluster around her, but they're not on any frames and they don't have any comb yet. So that's one way to purchase bees, right? So we also have a nuke, which is short for Hive Nucleus, and then you can also catch a swarm of bees. That's another way to get started with bees, right? So this comes with a little can of syrup right here, and the can's got a couple little holes in there, so the bees can. They packed a lunch for them out in California for their trip, right? So this is just temporary sugar for them for a few days until you can get them in a hive, right? And then see this little tab right on the top of it here, that is where the queen is. So we'll show you how to take this apart, put the bees in a hive here in just a little bit. So that's one way to get bees. This is a two pound package. They make them in 3 pounds, and they make them in 4 pounds also. This is kind of the standard for the industry. Out of a hive, landed in a tree, you'd see about a cluster about that size, maybe a little smaller than a soccer ball size, right? So if you have this many bees in a hive, that's kind of the minimum for them to maintain a hive while some of the bees are dying off, right? And they're waiting for a new generation of bees to emerge. You've got to have that much population to keep your hive going. So I'm mentioning this now because sometime in your beekeeping hobby, you're going to have a colony that's dwindled down. You might have one frame of bees in there, right? And if you get down to maybe less than a pound and a half of bees, they're probably not going to be able to maintain enough warmth in the colony to survive for the winter. They're not going to have enough workforce. They're not going to be able to replace the ones that die soon enough, quick enough to survive.
Is that true all over the world?
In temperate climates, I would say yes. And so different varieties of bees have a larger cluster than others, right? We've bred bees to be prolific layers, right? So they have a bigger cluster. Let's say in tropical regions like the Africanized honeybee, they maintain a smaller cluster because they've got flowers year round, right? They're not going to have to maintain a population over winter. They can replace their bees year round, and they have flowers year round, so they can get by with a little smaller population. So if you had, let's say I was trying to make it a choice about, my bees gonna do okay? Do I need to buy a new queen? I can't find the queen in my hive. Well, if you only have let's say you only have 2 frames, there's only maybe 1.5 pounds, less than that amount of bees on 2 frames of bees. I wouldn't waste your money ordering a new queen. They're probably not going to make it. It might depend on what time of year it is, but right. So if you're trying to decide, well, are my bees strong enough to get through the winter? I need to go buy a bag of sugar to feed them to get them up to speed, right? Well, if there's less than 2 frames of bees in there, I don't know if I'd put a whole lot of effort into it. Okay, so there's a package. This will be a nuke. So we have some customers that ordered nukes, and we'll have some more available. The standard for the industry is 5 frames. So you don't have to have a nuke box if you're going to make it split, right? We do lots of them, so I've made a smaller box. This is essentially the same as this, only just a little bit narrower, right? So this one holds actually 6 frames plus a peak, right? So a 5-frame nuke is another way to buy these. And then if you catch a swarm, so typically you'll hear people tell about these bees that landed in their tree, or if they know you're a beekeeper, you're going to get a phone call that says, "Hey, I've got these bees that are in my tree here. I don't want to kill them. Do you want to come and get them?" Let me talk just briefly about swarms. It's a good way to catch them. They're always different. Sometimes they're high up in the tree, sometimes they're almost on the ground. And when you get that phone call about a swarm of bees, do you want them? You're going to need to quiz them and make sure, first of all, that they are honeybees, right? They're not wasps, so they're not ground bees. All right. So before you get your ladder and you get your pruning shears or your chainsaw and you get everything and you get your box ready in the truck and you're heading off to drive an hour to go pick them up, make sure they're honeybees before you go. So. You want to do it. You want to do it nicely too. Don't insult the person. "Oh yeah, they're honeybees, I'm sure." Ask them what color they are. ask them.
If they're fuzzy
So
or not.
sometimes people will call you up and say, "Hey, we've got bees in our trees. You want them?" Well, they're on the flowers in the trees, right? The whole tree's just buzzing. So if it's a swarm of bees, right, they're going to be clustered like this one, right? They'll be in a tight group and they'll be hanging on there like a teardrop shape, All right. So anyway, those are the different ways to get bees. It's nice to get them, nice to catch swarms. So if you catch a swarm of bees, they've left everything from their hive, and so they need to be fed. It's supposed to rain tomorrow, isn't it? So that means you're installing your packages tonight. They don't have any food other than their canned lunch that they got sent with, and we'll show you how to use that. But still, if it rains for a few days, they could starve right away. You could kill a package in a hurry. So the same thing goes with packages as does with swarms. If you catch a swarm and it's bad weather, they're going to need something to eat. So a lot of you have honey left over from your hive that died last year. So we just installed a bunch of packages yesterday, and I had enough honey. We just put a frame or two of honey with them. So now I don't have to go buy sugar. I don't have to mix up the syrup. I don't have to take it to the bees and feed it, right? So if you have honey, that's the best. That's of course the best nutrition for them, right? But if you don't have that, if you're starting from scratch, or if you had bees that had honey in them last fall and they died, but they got robbed out, your neighbor's bees came and took all the honey away. Now you've got empty comb. You're going to have to feed them something. So be sure to feed your package or feed a swarm. Yeah.
What about the old crystallized honey?
That's fine. They'll liquefy it and use it. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. There's lots of different kinds of feeders if you're going to feed them syrup, right? So if you don't have a frame with honey in it, the next best thing is sugar syrup. Now you want to get just get table sugar, sucrose, right? You can buy it in a bag. It costs you $12-15 for a 25-pound bag. If you bought one bag of that, it would make about 3 gallons of syrup. Typically, when we have to feed these, just to get our bees up to speed before they're on their own and they're taken off, I'll feed them 2.5 gallons of syrup. So this is a frame feeder, right? You just take out a frame out of your beehive and put that in place instead. This has, they make them with ladders in there so the bees don't drown, but I just put a little stick in there, right? So the bees won't drown in there. These are notorious for drowning bees. All of the feeders have good points about them and bad points, So these just seem to be most convenient, at least for me, for the way I use them.
What does the sticks do?
Well, the stick's just a life raft, essentially, right? So it floats on top of the syrup. When I fill this up with syrup, it'll be floating on top, so the bees can land on this and then drink the syrup over the sides as it slowly goes down the syrup. Right?
How quickly do they drink it?
So if the bees are really hungry, they could pick this up in a day. They won't eat all that, but they'll take it out of the feeder, right, and they'll store it in the comb. So you'll have if you have drawn comb. So if you have foundation, that's just foundation, right? It'll take the bees longer to draw a comb out, so they have a place to put the feed, right? Then they may have to work on it a week, right? But if they have drawn comb already and it's just empty, they've already got their cells built. All they have to do is pick up the syrup, put it in the cells, right? Dry it out a little bit, right? So it doesn't ferment. And so they could pick this up in a day and put it in the comb. So.
How do you know when to stop feeding them?
Well, the bees will just keep eating. So as long as there's something to do, generally they'll just keep picking up. And if they're raising brood, right, so they've got more mouths to feed coming up, they'll just keep storing honey. Bees like to work. So if they got something to do, they'll do it. So you can feed them all summer long. Sometimes beginning beekeepers feed the bees so much that they swarm. First year, you take a package like this and just feed the heck out of it, and they'll swarm by June. So, yeah. And then you'll have two. Then you'll have to go catch them and put them. The problem is if they swarm, though, sometimes you miss them. They fly away and you don't get them back. And so we want to keep them in the hive. So when they start capping honey over, and you'll see some here in a minute as we look in a real beehive, that means they're storing. They've got enough for their immediate use, and they're going to store some for later. So as soon as they start putting a cap on top of the cell, then you know they've got enough for that. So there's other ways you can know too. I mean, you can look at a hive. You can lift a hive and tell how heavy it is. If you got some experience, think, well, you know, they're about out of food. I got to feed them. So you'll know not to stop. If the hive's super heavy, stop feeding. Right? As long as it's honey in there, right, and not just pollen. Sometimes your bees will hoard pollen. There'll be a whole bottom box clear full of pollen in there, and you'll think, oh, it's heavy, we're going into winter in good shape. I've got plenty of weight on my beehive, right? And the bottom box is full of pollen. That's so they can't use pollen for feed for overwintering, right? They need pollen, that's the amino acids to raise the baby bees, right? That's the building blocks for the new. So once a bee is an adult, then they just need sugar. So the question is how do I know if my comb from last year is okay to reuse, right? So sometimes if the bees will be clustered on the comb there, and then if they've been dead a while and it's moist inside the hive, they'll get moldy and start to decompose and it'll stink a little bit. So as long as the reason that they died is not foul brood, so it's foul brood as in a foul smelling, right? And that's a bacteria that gets into the larva and kills them, and then it spreads. But if the bees died from winter, it's too moist in the hive, or they died because they starved and they're just a big cluster there, then it's okay to reuse. It may be moldy a little bit, but you can just scrape it off. So the question is how long does it take for the bees to get up to speed, right, until the next generation of bees is emerging from there, right? So it's important that you know this. This is a great question because you should follow. There should be a general timeline throughout the summer, throughout all the seasons, where your bees should be at. And if they're not there, if they're not at that point where they should be, then we know there's something wrong. The queen has failed, or they're starving, or maybe it's not our fault, maybe it's just the weather and everything's slowed down. But we're going to take each month throughout this summer here, we'll show you a hive that's going to be the average of where they should be. So we'll see how they draw comb out, and they'll start drawing comb out immediately as soon as they have the resources. It'll take them probably a couple of weeks to have the comb drawn out on most of the frames, maybe 3 to 4 frames if you're starting from foundation. And then as soon as, and that cell doesn't have to be drawn out all the way the depth typically that they'll use before the queen starts to lay eggs in them, right? So they can actually still be drawing out comb The queen will lay eggs in it. They'll finish that out and cap the brood over. So that's going to happen. That's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. Bees will recycle honey, of course, and they'll recycle small bits of wax. So when we're in a beehive, and I'm trying to get frames out. We've got some bridge comb and bird comb stuck all over the place. Rather than just scrape it off and throw it on the ground, sometimes these small pieces I'll just throw them back in the hive. They'll chew them down remote. If it's too big of a chunk of wax though, they won't use it. And they won't pick it up outside of the hive. So if honey was spilled outside of the hive, they'll recycle. They'll come and get that and bring it back. If it's wax, they're not going to chew it down. Now they will do propolis, right? So there's propolis, the bee glue, plant resins that they stick everything down with. They'll recycle that. So if I have a pile of bee boxes in my yard, you know, and it's got propolis all over it, those robber bees or the propolis gatherers, they'll come in rather than have to go to the cottonwood tree or whatever plant they're gathering that from. They'll just come back and pick it up out of the beehive and recycle that. But typically they won't bring wax back.
Where do they get wax from?
So wax, they produce wax. They have glands that turn honey into wax, right? And it secretes these little scales out of the segments in their abdomen. And they'll produce these little flakes of wax, and they pick up those flakes, and then they mold them and form them into the hexagons, right? So on foundation, we start with a little hexagon like they want. That gets them started, right? But they build that out from there. So this is plastic. You can buy foundation that's pure beeswax, which they prefer, but this is a little sturdier. This makes it nicer for us when we extract and when we're moving frames around. So you'll see some foundation that the bees built themselves on some of these middle bar frames. I've got some up here. I gave them a little start there. You can see where they've just started it, but they'll fill in the rest of that without me priming.
Does it take them much longer if they don't have foundation?
No. So we use this foundation. It's convenient for the beekeeper. So the bees would prefer just to have space, right? They essentially say, okay, well we appreciate the offer of giving us that foundation. We know that's convenient for you beekeepers, but really all we need is space. We know how to make comb. Thanks anyway, but if we have space, we'll just do it on our own. You'll find that if you keep bees long enough, right? There'll be an occasion when you'll be going through a box, right? And you'll take a frame of honey out or something, and you'll forget. You'll leave a space like that. And so, say all the frames next to it had just foundation. You'll come back, and they're drawing comb right in that space. They say, "Oh, good! Finally, we can make the drones. We can make the size of cell that we want. We can make a whole bunch of drones in there. Thank you for the space. We'll get right busy on that." So the question there is, when have the bees got enough room? When do they have too much room? Right? When do you put a super on? Right? So when we refer to supers, it's any box above the bottom box, right? There's a good timing for that. So if you let them stay in there too long, then they're going to say, "Hey, we're too crowded. We've got to find a new place to live. We're going to swarm. Let's start making queen cells." And so, but if you do it too soon, then they're going to build in a chimney fashion up there. So they like to build where the heat is. So if you start out, let's say you bought a nuke, and you put your nuke in your box here, you put it in the box like this, so we can install our nuke 5-frame Hive Nucleus right in the middle, right? So the cluster of bees in the brood chamber and the heat, where they've got to keep the temperature really consistent and the humidity, is where the brood is, where the baby bees are. So they're right in the middle. And so if I put another box on there, before they started working on these other frames, right, they're going to want to keep that temperature just right where the brood is, and so they're likely to build up straight up above it, and they're not going to fill out the ones on the sides. Yeah, winter time, so they'll have extra space in there. They'll have to keep the box warm, right? They've got to generate heat to keep it warm. So if they have lots of extra space, it's harder for them to keep it warm. So the bees do much better. The reason we're starting packages out in a smaller box, right, is it's a lot easier for the bees to stay warm in this little box. If they can stay warmer, then they're going to expand their brood chamber a little bit more than they otherwise would in a bigger box, right? And they're more efficient at it, at drawing the comb. Sometimes you'll get comb that's only drawn out part way, or they'll only draw out one side of it, right? And so, or else they start drawing it out, and then they stop. When they start and stop and start and stop again, then sometimes they get off foundation. They'll start building the other direction. You've got another foundation that's in between your two frames, you know. So if you can get those bees focused on fewer frames, let them complete those frames, finish the job, then move on to the other ones. They do a much better job of drawing the comb out. It makes it more convenient for us beekeepers if the frame's consistent. So winter doesn't kill bees, right? It's there's other things. It's not just a cold, right? So most bees are lost if you're trying to get the bees through the winter. We don't lose them generally in December or January. They're doing just fine. They're the coldest part of the winter. It's February and March when the bees die. So I've heard a lot of people already today say, well, my bees were just fine a month ago. They were first part of March, they were doing good, and then next time I checked them, so sometimes it's referred to as spring dwindling. And so getting bees ready for winter really starts right now, right? So we make sure that we get them off to a really good start, and then they build up strength throughout the summer, and then in the fall we make sure we leave them enough honey for the winter time coming up, right? So we only harvest what they can spare, right? So we specifically bred bees. We keep the ones that make the most honey, right? So that just means more surplus for us. We still got to leave the bees enough to get through the winter, but if the more surplus they make, the more honey we get. So, but when we don't want to get greedy when we take that honey off in the fall. We want to make sure they're healthy going into winter. That's a main component of overwintering bees successfully. We've got to make sure they're disease-free. We want to make sure we get the mites out of there before winter starts, and make sure they got enough honey. Make sure the hive is got a good lid on it, right? So it doesn't get the moisture in there can ventilate out, right? So they don't get wet in the beehive. That'll kill them. It's not the cold that kills them, but it's wet. It's like us, you know, if you went out in the wintertime, we can stand some pretty cold temperatures as long as you stay dry. But, you know, if you get your feet wet, right, if you get wet, then it's harder to stand the colder temperatures. So same thing inside a beehive. There's been lots of different devices and techniques to keep the moisture out of the beehive. Some of them work better than others. Some of them actually backfire on you. We want to make sure that we get the bees fed, all they're going to need stored up before winter gets here. We don't want to have an emergency in the middle of winter and think we got to feed them in the middle of winter. We don't want to make up a candy board or fondant and put in there, or syrup. We don't want to put a liquid syrup in the beehive in the wintertime. So bees won't pick up liquid if their body temperature is less than 50 degrees, right? It cools them down, and so we don't want to feed them liquid. We want to get all that done while the weather's still good. If you feed bees, then they're going to need to digest that food. They're going to need to process that food. If they're going to need to, if they do that, then they've got to come outside for their cleansing flight. So if you feed bees in the wintertime and they can't get out for a potty break, right, now they're going to get dysentery, they're going to mess in the hive, and that's probably going to kill them too. So we want to feed the bees only if we have to, as a last resort emergency in the springtime. If they're too light, we missed our guess on how much honey to take away, or maybe whatever circumstance might happen, robbing or otherwise. We didn't get them heavy enough going through the winter, so we have to feed them. There's some things you can do, but it's going to drastically reduce your percentage or your chances of getting them through the winter if we have to feed them in the winter. So we want to make sure that we have, first of all, honey. That's the best nutrition for them. If we don't have enough honey in the hive, getting close to fall, in the summer and fall, we're going to have to feed them sugar to get them up to weight, right? We don't want to feed bees sugar, but sometimes, many occasions, it's either that or they're going to die. So we're going to do what we can to keep them alive. So it's packages or swarms or an emergency before winter. They're not heavy enough. We got to feed them something. So we'll do that. So bees won't pick up syrup anyway if they're too cold. If the syrup's cold, because it'll cool their body temperature down, then they can't get back to the cluster, so they won't go into the feeder. So if you had to feed them liquid you'd want to use a different type of feeder than this, because they've got to leave the cluster, crawl in here, take the feed up, and then back. So you could use an upside down jar right above the cluster. So just like the new feeder that's going to build up, put the brood chamber up, because that's where the heat is. If the feed is right above where that heat is, then they can pick that syrup up without cooling themselves down. They can process it. So the bees have to have a certain temperature, and they've got to have a circulation going in the beehive to dry out feed. So if you're going to feed them sugar syrup, it's going to be lighter, it's going to be a higher moisture content than the bees need to store it. If they store it at above 19–20% moisture, then it's going to ferment. So the bees have to dry it out. And so if you feed them syrup too late in the year in preparation for winter, they don't have time to dry the honey out. Then it can ferment in the beehive, and then if that's all the thing they have for food, then they can get sick eating fermented honey. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to make sure we've got them fed and healthy before we're going into winter.
So you talked about how to do it wrong. Now tell how to do it right. Like how do you,
okay.
when do you feed them? Like what's the timing like on that?
All right, so so for our seasons around here, so what we want to do is make sure we've got our feeding done by, all right, let me back up. It's connected to taking honey off. So we'll go through the season, and if the bees did well that summer and they've got a surplus of honey, we're going to want to harvest that about the end of August, right? So if the fall, and fall's a bit tricky because sometimes there's some good sources for nectar and pollen in the fall around here, and sometimes it doesn't turn out. So if we take the surplus honey off about the end of August, we've got September and maybe half of October for the bees to pick up some rabbit brush. If you're in town, there's lots of ornamentals around town that they can pick up some nectar and pollen from. So they should be able to replace some of that honey going into winter, right? And so if we take the honey off in August, we got to watch them carefully if we need to feed. Maybe we took too much honey, we're going to need to feed during September. That's the time to feed. We want to have our feeding done by September, right? Some years we get some enough time in the first part of October to feed them. It's warm enough, they're flying, they're drying out honey. They can cap it over before winter gets here. So that's about the time frame we need to do it right. If you're going to feed bees, that's when to do it, right?
When you're done feeding, how heavy should they be?
Okay, so typically, so we mentioned Sanpete County, 120 pounds, that's about right for Sanpete County. Here in Utah County, we usually get by, if you've got your bees going into winter with 2 boxes like this, so we've got, and they're not clear full of honey, right? That's bees too, there's pollen. So we have maybe 10 frames of honey, but there might be 6 frames up here and 4 frames of honey down here on the sides, a couple frames on the side. So that should be about 100 pounds worth of the box, the bees, the honey, the pollen, and everything going into winter for Wasatch Front. Maybe a little more if you're up the canyon, you're up higher elevation, you're going to have a little longer winter. You better give them another frame or 2 of honey to get them through. Yeah, question here.
My bees starved, and when I was going through my hive, I found 2 frames that were 50–75% covered with brood. Do I keep that, or do I throw that away when I put my pack?
Right, so if the bees didn't die from disease, it was just starvation, they'll chew off the caps off of that dead brood under there, right? And they'll clean it out. You'll see out the front, if you put a package in, you come in the next day and you'll see they're cleaning house, right? They're kicking out the debris. They'll clean that up. If it's a lot of work for them, I like to take my hive tool and I'll scrape it down for them, so it's just not so much work and it's not so much mess. You can hold the frame just right and hit it on the side of the larva, and that pops the larva out of there. So there's ways you can clean it up short of scraping it all the way down to the foundation. Mites. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways to get rid of the mites. We don't get rid of them completely, of course, but we can knock their population down so that they're manageable. So ideally, we'd like the bees to do that themselves, and the industry could, that could happen, but it would collapse the industry if we did it all at once. So the best way to get rid of mites would be to let them let them do it on their own, the bees do it on their own. But to do that, we just have to stop treating with anything, to do nothing. If they survive, if they have some hygienic behavior, if they have some grooming to their character traits that will bite the legs on those mites or knock the mites off of them, then or another way of detecting them, we have some variety of bees out there. They're called varroa suppression, hygienic. They can smell that mite underneath a cap, and they'll uncap it so it interrupts the mite's reproductive cycle. So the bees, ideally, if we could get the bees to do it themselves, that's the way to do it. So, but if we just let all the bees go, we didn't treat for anything, the beekeeping industry would collapse. And that means the almond industry would collapse. And that means you wouldn't have almond butter, you wouldn't have almond milk, you wouldn't have almond slivers, you wouldn't have. So we put, there's billions of dollars worth of damage that would be done to the ag industry and the food industry right there. So we got to do something, right? So we put in we come up with some ideas to reduce the mite levels. Some of those include harsh synthetic chemicals we can put in there, miticides, right? The poison, we'll put in there poison and kill the mites, but not enough poison to kill the bees. Right? So that's one way to do it. There's other ways to do it. We can, there's different natural ways to assist the bees in reducing the mite loads. So there's a whole bunch of them. One of the things we're doing right now at the honey company is I'm trying to find some ways to put the genetics that we used to have in the bee population back into the bees. So if you've read about our feral bee project, that's what it's all about. So let me just briefly say on the subject of mites, we caught some bees down on the Navajo Nation. We were selling some bees to somebody down there, and they said, oh, by the way, we have somebody down here who's got some bees that moved into their trailer. We'd like to get them out of there so we can live in the trailer again. So could you help us with that? So we went down, we cut them out, we took the siding off the camp trailer, we got in there, we did a cutout, right? And so when I did that, I tested for mites. We have a way to test the population and see how many mites are in there. And we did find mites in there, but there are only very few of them. So we'll never get rid of all the mites, but we can reduce them down. So we're going to take those bees that were obviously nobody was treating for mites down there. The bees that are feral out there living in the rocks and the trees, nobody's treating them for mites, and they're surviving. And so they're managing their mites. So we want to take those genetics, so whatever character trait it is that they have, and we want to include those in our commercial bee population and our hobby bee population, and so that we can reduce these mite population and the trouble we're having with it without having to use expensive and harsh chemicals that end up in the honey, that end up in the wax. There's a bunch of different things on the market. That's a whole nother class there, but that's just a brief overview.
How are those guys' honey's production?
The feral ones?
Yeah.
Really good. They don't, so we've bred bees genetically for the ones that make the most honey. Right. So as you might expect, if you were catching wild bees that have been on there for a long time, they don't make as much surplus as some of our other, our production queens. Yeah, so, right. But still good. I mean, they're still making a surplus. Yeah.
Is there an easy way to detect that you have mites?
Yeah, there is. So some of that's experience. You can look in a hive without doing a specific test. But there's, I'll give you a couple of quick ones, and then we'll get to your question. So there's, you could take a paper plate, take a picnic plate, right, and spray it with Pam cooking oil, and put it in the bottom bar. In the bottom board of your hive, and then come back later and see what falls down. So the mites, if the bees are hygienic, right, they're going to keep a pretty clean bottom board. They'll kick everything out. But if it sticks on that oily plate, you'll see mites in there. That's a quick, easy way to do it. They make a little tool. You can do a sugar roll. It's just a mason jar with a screen, and you can put some bees in it, and then you can dump some powdered sugar on it, and you roll them around in there. And that'll knock the mites off. It'll dislodge the mites off the bee, and so you can count mites that way. That's not really easy. It's not really hard, but it's not a quick, easy way to do it. You can just look at the bees. Sometimes you'll know when you can recognize the symptoms of a mite overload. You just look at a frame of brood, and you can tell by sometimes a spotty brood pattern. will tell. We could probably look in a hive right now where there's no bees and there's no mites on the bottom board, but we can look at a hive and say, okay, your bees probably died because of varroa mite, because there's no bees, there's a bunch of honey in there, right? They were doing well last summer, so there's little tricks there that you can just tell whether they got a mite overload or not. And then there's the real scientific tests you can do to actually count the percentage and numbers of it.
So there's always mites, it's just an overload of mites.
Right,
Is that-
that's it. We're never gonna get rid of them completely, yeah.
I've just heard about a few people who have frames left from a hive that died over winter.
Yeah,
That they freeze it first.
okay.
Is that to kill anything that's left on it, or is it to preserve it? Like, what's
Yeah.
that for?
It's not a bad idea. If you've got a chest freezer and you got space to do that, you could freeze it. So that's probably mostly to keep the wax moth from getting on there and tearing it apart. And you probably don't have mice inside your freezer, so that's a good safe place for it. And so other pests like that, earwigs, ants, that protects them from that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be frozen, but that's a good way to do it. The freezing cold temperature won't kill foul brood. The only thing we're really worried about with old frames is foul brood. That's a bacteria, and those spores will stay alive if they're frozen or not. So that won't help with that. So if you got foul brood, you're better off putting it in the oven than the freezer, right?
Burning it?
Burn it. Clorox will not kill American foul brood spores, no. So it might help with a European foul brood, but the spores in the spore form, no. There's nothing that'll kill it. If you put in Tylosin, an antibiotic, or you put in tetracycline, that spore would have to be germinated, or a bee larva would have to have it in its gut, and so it's come out of its spore form and it's in its regular bacteria shape and form for that antibiotic to work. And so even the antibiotics, depending on what time you put them in, don't even work. The only sure way to get rid of American foul brood is burn it.
Like burn it to destruction.
Yep. Build a fire pit, and throw it in, and all done. Because you don't want to. You send it to the landfill, and then the neighbors' bees come over and rob that out, and then it gets spread again.
Do you
Yep.
make those middle bar frames?
Yeah. So I do. Yeah. So the middle bar frames. We used to. When we moved, we stopped having people wanting to drive all the way down to pick them up. So I kind of quit making frames anymore. But yeah, this is my idea. This middle bar thing. So this I made for comb honey was the original idea. There's lots of other uses for it, but we made this for comb honey, and you don't have to have this starter strip in here, but it helps, gets them going in a straight line, right? So then you can cut your chunk honey out of here, right?
So did you just make the middle piece yourself?
You can make
Take
it.
the bottom bar and
Yeah,
cut it?
yeah. It's just a regular frame, and you don't have to. You could buy round dowels and just drill a hole, 1/4-inch hole in the ends there, and put a round dowel and do the same thing. Right, if you have a table saw, you can cut out square ones, but then you need, I've got a mortise jig to cut that square hole in there. It's just easier for me to do, because if you're buying lots of round dowels, they're expensive. But yeah, you can make those yourself easy enough. Yeah, there's a lot of uses for them. You'll see some on our YouTube, and we'll
I like
check.
that just better than like fishing line or wire.
Yeah, it works well for doing cutouts. Anyway, there's lots of uses for that I didn't even know existed when I made it. Yeah.
What do you do if you do get the wax moths?
Wax moth, they can be, if you get a lot of them in there, they'll just chew everything up. So wax moth is nature's way of taking care of an abandoned beehive. So imagine they're in the rocks or in the trees, right? And that wax in there is so old that the bees say, well, we're having trouble maintaining this old house. We're going to just move and find another one. So the bees move out. It's a good location. They like the neighborhood's nice, right? But the house is run down. So the bees swarm and they move out, and then the wax moth comes in, chews everything up, gets rid of any disease, or gets rid of all that old wax, right? And then the bees swarm a few years later and move back in, right? Kick out all the debris and build new wax again. So wax moth's kind of nature's way of cleaning up a mess, right? They're scavengers really, and so. If the damage isn't too great, then you can just cut it out. So you'll get wax moth. But I'll just take my hive tool and I'll scrape it down. They make that, you know, like a worm when it spins that mat, the silk, the cocoon kind of thing, it'll be all over there. So if the damage is really, it won't hurt the plastic. You could scrape it down to plastic, pressure wash it. That's what I do sometimes. They will damage, they do chew into the wood a little bit. So if your frame's really damaged, then maybe it's not replaceable. But usually you can salvage the frames, and if it's a plastic foundation, you can scrape it down, put it back in, start over. So there's not really a disease that the wax moth would have. It'll look terrible and you think, I just throw it away, you know, it's ruined. But you can clean it up if you want. It's not that expensive to buy, you know, a few new frames from wax moth damage. Buy new ones if you want, clean it up if you want. If it's not extensive, just scrape it off, put it back in, the bees will fix it.
Let's say you wanted, like, if you don't have, like, they didn't have enough honey and you didn't want to feed them liquid syrup, could you, like, put, like, some kind of, like, candy in there or, like, a marshmallow if you wanted to instead?
Yeah, so molasses, no, that'll kill bees. Brown sugar, no, that's bad for them. Agave nectar, probably, they're probably okay with that. But so high fructose corn syrup, a lot of beekeepers will feed them that. I don't like to, I don't think they do well on that. If you put out a dish, let's say we had molasses, we had brown sugar, we had sucrose, table sugar, we had, go down the list of all the different sweeteners, and you give the bees a choice, okay, what do you want for lunch? And they'll go to the sucrose, table sugar, right? So that's what they want, and that's what they do the best on if we're gonna feed them something artificial.
So if you wanted to, you could, like, basically just get the sugar and kind of just boil it on the stove and basically crystallize it, and then you can put it in there if you wanted to.
So we don't want to boil it. I'm glad you brought that up. So if you warm it up, if it's just warm, it's easier to mix, and so that saves you a little trouble. But if you boil it, it'll make something, it'll change the chemical structure in there. I'll make an attempt at the word hydroxymethylfurfuryl. I think I got it pretty close. Yeah, it'll do that, and that's bad for bees. It's bad for us. If cooked sugar is bad for us. If you caramelize it, very bad. Yeah. So, okay.
People do like crystallize it in fondant squares though. Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
just like no moisture in the sugar crystals, but not.
right. Yeah, so if you're making a fondant, a sugar candy, a cake or whatever.
Not
then-
marshmallow fondant, but it's a different thing
Yeah,
for bees.
yeah, not cake fondant. It's like we would, yeah, different, that's different.
Some people
Don't
just
feel
put sugar on a piece of like parchment paper.
Yeah.
And then squirt it with a little water so that it hardens a little so it doesn't spill every time you
Yeah.
check on them. And that's easy because it's just straight sugar.
Okay.
Spray bottles for?
Oh, yeah, I'll show you right. So we're gonna start with the smoker when we get out there. That's one way to keep the bees pleasant while we're working on them. Another way is to have, this is just sucrose, sugar syrup, and I put a little honey in there just for flavor, right? So I'll show you how to use this to keep the bees calm. If you'd rather use that than the smoker, this you can use for several different purposes. Shall we go out and look in a beehive? All right. So we've got them, they're over in the corner of the lot, the yard over here this way. Let's walk, anyway, just don't walk right through the middle of the garden. We'll meet you out.